My name is Henk Don. I'm a member of the board of the Authority for Consumers and Markets in the Netherlands. And it's my pleasure to moderate the first panel session today. The subject of the first panel, as announced in the Stakeholder Forum agenda, is how to best incentivize new models of investment and competition in the access framework. In the debate about the new European Electronic Communication Code, one important question is how to best balance the objectives of incentivizing investment in very high capacity networks and promoting and protecting competition. Is there a trade-off between competition and investment? Or is it, as BEREC puts it in one of its papers, a demand-driven virtuous cycle of competition and investment? In this panel, we have representatives of companies with different models of investment who can shed light, I hope, on this question from their business perspective. What rules and regulations, if any, would help them meet their investment challenges? As a kickoff, we will start with an introductory keynote speech by Mr. Maxime Lombardini. Since 2007, Mr. Lombardini is the CEO of Iliad. Iliad is a company, access-based operator in France, and will soon start a similar business in Italy. And I'm curious to hear about his investment challenges in this current setting. Mr. Lombardini, if you please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to deliver this short presentation. I think it is interesting to have a look to the French situation because there is many theory on the opposition between investment and competition. And in France, for the last 6 years, we have really the demonstration on the ground. France is a very competitive market, probably one of the most competitive on both the fixed and mobile market, for sure in Europe and probably in the world. And we have also one of the highest level of investment. As you perhaps know, in France, we have 4 players. 4 of them are integrated players, both on fixed and mobile. And we are pushing a very luxurious NGA strategy because the 4 players, together with the state, which is subsidizing in the less dense areas, we are pushing an FTTH deployment, which is quite well advanced because we will reach probably around 10 to 11 million households in terms of FTTH footprint at the end of the year. When I mean we will reach, I mean all together. You can see the figure in 2000, in the middle of this timeline, there has been the entry of the 4th mobile operator, meaning Free Mobile, that has taken close to 20% market share in 5 years. So it has put pressure on the revenues of the competitors. You can see that on the line on the bottom. And the other one, the red one, is the investment line. So you can see that in France very clearly, pushing competition on the mobile and then on the DSL has pushed the competitors and ourselves first to deploy 4G very quickly. So there has been a very strong competition on the deployment of 4G, and it has pushed also to differentiating through the NGAs. So the best way to avoid the price competition on the DSL market, which is very strong, is to deploy FTTH network and to try to migrate or to get new customers on the FTTH where there is less fluidity and less price competition. On the FTTH, the issue is much more being able to connect the customer than a price issue. So I think this very simple chart is the best summary we can have of this debate between competition, which means price pressure, and investment. Then, to follow up on this path, you can see that in relative terms, meaning in a proportion of the revenues, the altnets are investing much more than the incumbent. we have Iliad, our company, on the top line. So those figures, I think, are apart from the frequencies. On top of that, we have to pay the price of the frequencies. And you can see that the other altnets are also investing a lot, and that the total of that gives those figures. I'm sorry, the chart is a bit complicated, but that is the capex in France of the 4 players, which represents most of the investments. You can see that everybody is investing, and that the altnets are investing altogether more than the incumbent. So when you hear the debate on the fact that we need a regulatory vacation, or that there is a need for regulatory vacation to allow the biggest one to invest, it is totally unbelievable, because the reality is very different. You can see in France, but it is the same in many other countries of Europe, that the altnets plays a very significant role in deploying the networks and in pushing investment. And the last important chart for me to demonstrate what happens on the ground is that with the current framework, that is not post-review, that is before the review, you can see that the incumbent, with the, let's say, strong regulation, has a capacity to grab something like 70% market share of the NGA network, and that even with a strong regulator, we have a very strong advantage to the incumbent, because the capacity to deploy network, technically, not in financial terms, is much more with the incumbent than with the new entrants. So to make it simple, do not believe the very simplistic message that we hear very often, that there is too many players in Europe and that there is only 4 in the US, and that for this reason, the US can invest. When you look at the detail, you can see that in the US, the coverage is very poor, that the prices are very high, and I don't think it is an example for Europe. Don't believe the fact that Europe is lagging behind. That is absolutely, sorry, it is not true. And regarding FTTH deployment, I think that many countries in Europe are really at the forefront, and that it will continue. We can see that there is an interest which is stronger and stronger in France in investing in FTTH. We've seen, including in the less dense areas where there is tender to get subsidies, that including private equity guys are coming and are asking for less and less subsidies, because having the capacity to control an infrastructure in such a business, meaning for decades, and getting revenues on such a business for decades has a very high value. So we are great believers in the fact that FTTH deployment is a good bargain, not a pain, and that there is no need for regulatory vacation to have a success in this field. And so, coming to the review of the code, there is many good things in the text as it is, but for us the point of attention are mainly the fact that when there is co-investment, when there is a co-investment proposal on the table, it is not enough for the incumbent to get regulatory vacation. We need, even when there is co-investment offer, a strong regulator with the capacity to come back on the play if there is discrimination or any other subject such as this one. We need that the review confirms the symmetric regulation, because when there is co-investment, and co-investment is a really good scheme to focus the investment on a single network but protecting competition, we need this regulation to exist. Very clearly, we have a preference for the passive infrastructure, opposite to any bitstream or VULA, which doesn't allow to differentiate and to innovate in the medium-long term. And then coming to the frequencies, the message of Mr. Gungel before on the 5G, I think is valuable also for 4G on 2 aspects. To make easier and to give the NRA the capacity to push sharing agreements on the especially on the less dense areas, or on the small cells in the future on the 5G, to make easier the deployment, and then to ensure that when granting license are taking into account the benefits in terms of competition and not only the price and the short-term benefit. So as a conclusion, you can see in France, I don't mean that France gives license to the world, but we have for the last 5 years a strong competition, very high investments, and FTTH networks which are progressing really fast, with a plan to have 80% of the households in France covered by FTTH by 2022, sorry. And there is nothing today that will prevent this deployment. So we are very optimistic on the FTTH deployment if the regulatory framework remains pro-competitive. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. Please take your seat with the panel. And please, other panelists, join us in these beautiful seats. I'm there. You're free. So I welcome Ms. Philippa Carvalho, Mr. Alistair Davidson, Mr. Brad Burnham, and Mr. Richard Feasy. And I suggest that we give each of them first the opportunity to give a statement of about between 5 and 10 minutes, in the order that I just indicated. So first, Ms. Carvalho, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share and participate on this debate. And thank you to BEREC for the invitation. So my presentation is very similar to the one from Iliad. So let me show you first. I need the remote. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much. So let me start by showing you some numbers, some figures from Portugal. Could you please? Okay. Okay. Portuguese markets in numbers. So Portugal is a very well placed in achieving the goals of digital agenda, and we have very good figures on coverage. We have, like you can see, 81% of our NGN network covers 81% of the population. We think that in 2020 we will have 3 operators in more than 60% of our territory. We also have a high penetration of converged services, and 99% of our territory, of our population, covered by 4G. So very good numbers, and we are very well placed to meet the objectives of the Commission. So, and why, you could ask, why can we achieve those goals? And when we have so many pressure on revenues and on profitability? And the answer is we have a very, very competitive market that leads us to a very strong investment approach. So, and we strongly believe in the virtuous circle of competitiveness goes to investment and also to innovation, and then we have a competition again. So I've also brought you capex to sales, and we are very well placed. We are one of the leading European investment countries, and NOS has the highest level of investment and higher than some altnets and some incumbents all over the Europe. So and how NOS looks at investment? Well, the thing is, and it is interesting for you to notice that since the beginning, and despite of our position in the market, if we were a new entrant, if we were the altnet, the one that struggles to compete, or if we are the operator that invest or try to grow organically, or even nowadays if we are the biggest operator in telecommunications and entertainment in Portugal, we always defended co-investment, always, since the beginning. We start to defending co-investment in civil infrastructures for mobile. Then we struggle to have an NGN network that could be used by every operators in the country. Then we made our own investment in NGNs, and then we start having the possibility to have sharing agreement with other companies, namely Vodafone, and we start with 400,000 houses in fiber in 2010. And most recently, we have signed a sharing agreement that covers 2.6 million houses all over the country, mostly green areas and some houses that we've already had. So specifically in what concerns the last agreement with Vodafone, we are talking about passive infrastructures only. And we should stress that we also respect differentiation, and the active equipments are our own responsibility, and so we can manage to differentiate products, commercial services, and innovation also. But at the same time that we defended co-investment, we've also made our own investments, and we've also had some wholesale access, mainly on white NGN areas. And for that, regulation was important. So how can regulation help? How did it help along those past 20 years or something like that, 19 years, and how will it help in the future? We believe that access based on SMP regulation is still needed. It's still needed essentially for ducts and poles, and should not be questioned. We also believe that deregulation based on co-investment should be seen very carefully. Like Iliad said, we cannot stand in a position that an incumbent or any company makes an wholesale offer, like a regulated offer, saying, well, I'm offering co-investment, and so please deregulate me. We cannot agree on that, and we cannot agree on automatic consequences bringing up upon those kind of co-investments. So leave co-investment to commercial agreements. They should appear, and also maintain the SMP toolkit where it seems necessary and adequate to address bottlenecks. So thank you very much. This is my key messages to start.
I forgot to mention one thing before we started the panel session here. The whole forum is web streamed, and the audience on the web stream is invited to use Twitter to participate in the discussion. So they can send tweets to hashtag BEREC Forum and submit questions to the panel, and we'll try to pick a few that we can answer. So our next panelist to introduce is Mr. Alistair Davidson from the Wireless Infrastructure Group in the UK, a wholesale-only operator for mobile, if I understand correctly.
Thank you.
If you please.
Good afternoon. Alistair Davidson from Wireless Infrastructure Group. I'm going to talk to you about our business model, about the incentives we have to share and to provide access to wholesale-only infrastructure, and the investment that our sector makes in rolling out new networks. So Wireless Infrastructure Group is an independent wireless infrastructure operator with 2,000 assets across the UK, Ireland, and Netherlands. And these include remote rural towers with multiple sharers on them, and they include fibre-connected small cell networks like the ones you can see in the picture there. When we set out to invest in these networks 10 years ago, there was very little in the way of a wholesale infrastructure business model. But to date, we've now invested over 500 million euros in independent infrastructure. Now, when I say independent, what I mean by independent is we have no retail networks. Independent infrastructure operators are wholesale only. They have no retail networks of their own, and so everything we invest and all the networks we build are to be shared by other networks. And in fact, not only do we include all of the mobile operators as our customers, we actually have over 120 other wireless networks using our infrastructure. And one of the exciting things about our sector is the huge pool of new investment that we can unlock to invest in connectivity challenges across the globe. So our own infrastructure investors are long-term, low cost of capital infrastructure funds, and they have a 30-year business horizon. So we have a very long investment business model horizon. And our shareholders are backing our ambitions to put another €1 billion into digital infrastructure across the UK, Netherlands, and Ireland. But it's essential to our business model that we get regulators and policy makers to understand our model, to understand the business model, to understand our incentives. And in the picture here, you've got a typical remote rural tower. This fine tower is at Glenfinnan in Scotland, and that tower is hosting 7 different wireless networks. Now, to tell you a little bit about our business model, we build a new piece of infrastructure with just one anchor customer. And with that one anchor customer, we'll make a loss. Now, that doesn't sound like a great business model, but we're confident that we will add other network operators over time. So that first anchor customer only gets charged for their capacity usage of a very high capacity asset, which means that they get to roll out their networks at a much lower economic threshold and at a much lower TCO than the self-build of their own network. And over time, we add those sharers, as you can see in this picture. But what is essential to our business model is that open access is at the heart of our business model. And we need no encouragement through regulation to open up for access, because that's what we do as a day job. And we have every incentive to share. So, as well as building new infrastructure, we've also played a key role in the industry by buying towers from mobile operators, strengthening them, enhancing them, and adding networks over time. And our sector has been phenomenally successful. And what this picture is displaying is that across Europe and North America, we have more than twice the connectivity of towers owned by mobile operators. And yet, the business model is behind in Europe. We have only 42% independent infrastructure in Europe compared to 68% globally. So there's great potential and room for growth here. As we move into a 5G world, the independent wireless infrastructure sector, the wholesale-only infrastructure, can play a major role. And in the picture here, you can see one of the small cells that we've literally lit up the fibre to in the last month with Telefonica as an anchor customer. In the US, around half the small cells deployed have been deployed by independent infrastructure companies. And in the UK, here in Aberdeen, in the picture that you can see, we've actually launched with Telefonica the first C-RAN network in the UK, again by independent infrastructure. So we'd urge policymakers and regulators to understand our very different business model and our very different incentives. We drive innovation, we drive competition, and all of our assets are already open for sharing. Now, in the new European Electronic Communications Code, we welcome the recognition of wholesale-only infrastructure as a new business model. And we welcome, therefore, the recognition in Article 77 and the lighter touch regulatory regime that's applied there to encourage and incentivize investment into this sector. In the same vein, though, we'd warn against other articles like Article 44 that could impose unwarranted access and price regulation on a sector which has no need of it. This sector didn't exist when the first mobile networks were rolled out. But over the last decade, this sector has grown to over 400 billion euros globally. The members of the European Wireless Infrastructure Association, which is the independent association in Europe, have over 60 billion euros of investments globally, and they're actively seeking to invest more in Europe now. So 5G, as we heard from BEREC earlier, is the new frontier in mobile communications. And with the right incentives, the right stable regulatory regime, independent infrastructure can make a massive difference in opening up that frontier. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Mr. Brad Burnham, co-founder and managing partner of Union Square Ventures. This is a US investment group investing in telecommunication networks. Mr. Burnham.
Thank you. So it's become pretty obvious to me that one of these people up here is not like the others. I am not from Europe. I am not, today that actively involved in the infrastructure investments. We have made recently 2 open access fiber network investments, but the primary, our primary investment focus has been at the applications layer of the internet. So what I'd like to do is step back and talk a little bit about where I come from, what my background is, to give you a little picture of why I might come down with a set of, with the worldview that I have. So I started my career over 35 years ago in working for AT&T in the United States, and I worked there for a number of years, and ended up eventually working for their venture capital group, where I made a number of investments in CLECs and DLECs, so competitive local exchange carriers and data local exchange carriers, as well as a bunch of internet infrastructure companies like Juniper Networks. So I learned a lot in the mid-90s about that infrastructure and the cost structure associated with it, and the challenges of competing in what was at the time an unsettled regulatory environment. As I moved into the 2000s, I started a new firm called Union Square Ventures, and at that time, we invested almost exclusively at the applications layer. So we were the first investors in Twitter, Tumblr, Foursquare, Etsy, Indeed, a number of these applications layer services. So what's encouraging to me in hearing the presentations that have gone on is so far is that it feels to me like Europe is actually in a much better place than the US right now in terms of getting broadband deployed, encouraging investment in that infrastructure. The US, it feels like we are still dominated by a duopoly of cable companies and telecommunications companies. There are very few third and fourth party players in those markets. And we find that when we enter those markets, as an example, in Charlottesville, North Carolina, or Charlottesville, Virginia, excuse me, one example of a market that one of our portfolio companies has entered. We find ourselves fighting a bit of a rearguard action with the incumbents, where getting access to the polls requires significant effort and often a court battle. As Google tried to do it in a number of cities, they found themselves in court with a number of the incumbents. So the whole idea of infrastructure sharing is really underdeveloped in the US. And it seems like such a good idea because, you know, a core part of this telecommunications infrastructure, the fiber infrastructure, isn't an asset that is evolving very quickly. It's a 50-year asset, and you know, yes, there have been some improvements in terms of the capacity, but it isn't something that you change out every year, and it makes a lot of sense to share that very stable common infrastructure and then innovate on top of that infrastructure. So you know, I think that, you know, the message to leave you with is I think that you're going to see the United States lag. The current administration has not been very supportive of net neutrality. The past administration was. One of the reasons that the past administration was supportive of net neutrality is it became very clear through a number of dialogues with investors like us that without an assurance of access to the end consumer, it was very difficult for us to invest in the applications layer. So in pretty much every single one of our services depends on being able to get unfettered access to consumers over a telecommunications network, either wired or wireless. And if those services are going to be throttled, or in some way the experience of the end user is going to be constrained by the access provider, it's really difficult for us to make a commitment to invest in those services. And we were able to communicate that to the last administration. They came out pretty strongly with what I think was a pretty good net neutrality framework. We'll see how it ultimately plays out. The one other thing I would throw out is that we are beginning to see in the United States a very rapid consolidation, both at the infrastructure layer and at the applications layer. So as an investor in startups, you know, it's become very clear that Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon have accumulated a significant amount of market power at the applications layer and made it very difficult to invest in new companies that might compete with them. That's a problem that we're going to have to address. There are a bunch of interesting ways we could talk about how it might be addressed. But there's another element to this, which is that we are, I think, going to have a panel this afternoon on convergence. And so as we start to see vertical integration between the access layer and the applications layer, the problem, at least in the US, is going to get worse. So we have already seen, you know, the Comcast purchase NBC, and now AT&T purchasing Time Warner, Verizon purchasing AOL and Yahoo. All of this is going to lead, it looks like, to a small number of essentially very large vertically integrated service providers from the access layer all the way up through the applications layer. That is going to be a really hard problem to regulate, and it's going to be very, very difficult to encourage investment in either the infrastructure or the applications layer if we end up in that sort of very limited competition mode. So, yeah, I mean, I think there is more to talk about in terms of the nature of the market power at the applications layer. These are data monopolies, and the nature of the market power at the access layer, terminating access monopolies. And there are some innovative things that I think could be done to manage both. Seems to me like you're a long way ahead in solving those problems. So I'm very encouraged by this conversation.
And the last member on the panel is Mr. Richard Vesey. He's an independent consultant, and I may say an industry veteran. He worked for Vodafone in the past and is now independent, as I said. And we hope he can link the models of investment to the new electronic communication code, what it should mean.
Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to make 3 points really about this interaction between investment incentives and the policy framework. So the first was I suppose to think about where we are today, particularly as BEREC is contemplating its sort of middle term strategy. And I think it's probably inevitable, given the focus on an SMP type framework, that the thinking around investment incentives therefore focuses on the large vertically integrated incumbent firms, because those are the only firms on which regulators can sort of get a grip through the process. But I also think actually that since the global financial crisis, certainly in my experience in the mid-2000s or late 2000s onwards, there's also been a sense that investment really can only be forthcoming from those kinds of pre-existing vertically integrated firms. And so I think a lot of the focus in the debate has been on that, which may not be perhaps altogether to the benefit of progress. If I look at the current proposals, which are seeking, in my view, modest adjustments to the incentives which those SMP firms face, I don't see those as producing the kind of real change, significant change in incentives that is really going to drive very meaningfully different behavior. So I think at the moment there is a misalignment between the ambition of the Commission and the Commission's Gigabit vision and proposals in terms of the way in which the incentives of the firms that are supposed to deliver it are aligned. My one specific proposal would be that actually you think about co-investment arrangements, for example, in the same way that you think about mergers, and that you would allow firms that were contemplating agreements amongst themselves to simply go to a regulator, notify the regulator of their intention to do that, and provide all the relevant information. And within a predetermined time period, the regulator would be obliged to issue a decision that would then be binding on the regulator, either authorizing the terms of that arrangement or not, after which the parties can get on with it. I think the risk at the moment that I see is that the regulator says, well, I'm not really going to take a view on this until I've seen it implemented in the market. And the participants say, well, we can't implement anything and take the risk of that in the market without some clarity as to what the regulatory rules would be. I think if we thought about them as we think about mergers and the authorities were required to issue a view and be bound by it, we might break that sort of cycle. The other point I just wanted to make about the framework is that I think we need to be careful about targets, because I think although it's easy to, and people often do, I think, dismiss targets of half of the European population having ultra-fast broadband by 2020 and so on, actually targets have a tendency over time of being, as we say in the UK, the tail that wags the dog. And you get over time, as you approach the point at which the target needs to be met, the policy framework gets distorted and adjusted in order to try and fit things to meet the target. And I think we've been too casual in Europe in setting targets that I think are not likely to be met and not frankly likely to be appropriate to a real understanding of what the continent requires. The second point I wanted to make briefly was that I think if you step back and think strategically about the nature of the problem, there are at least two problems. One is the lack of what I would call investable assets. So as I think we've heard, I don't think there is any problem with financing deployment of very high capability networks in Europe. There's plenty of cheap money around. The issue is there aren't assets into which that money can be deployed at the moment with the right risk profile, appropriate risk profile for the holders of that money. And I think it's worth more thought The characteristics of those kinds of assets are that they are typically, they don't have retail risk, and typically they don't have a lot of regulatory risk. So thinking that that money is going to be applied to existing vertically integrated firms that have lots of retail risk and potentially have regulatory risk as well, I think is a bit misguided. I am quite a fan of thinking about spinning out assets in the industry, particularly things like ducts, which it seems to me have intrinsic monopoly characteristics, and I think would then provide a focal point for money to come into the sector and be applied to then enable competition on top of that platform. And I don't think we have been in Europe ambitious enough in thinking about how regulation can actually create the investable assets against which finance can then be applied. I don't think there's a problem with capital, but there is a problem with things to deploy the capital against. The other side of that issue, I think, is if we think long term, we are going to have an issue about stranded assets. So there is a large amount of existing technology, as there is in the energy sector and in other industries, where if we are to effect a fundamental transformation of technology, assets will have to be written off. And I don't think enough thought has been given to how we facilitate that process and the writing off and scrappage of historic copper assets, separating them out from the assets that actually form part of the future, and creating a set of incentives that allow firms to actually move forward and retire things that need to be retired. And I think that is an area where, if BEREC is thinking about middle-term policy making, investors, owners of those assets, policymakers, and others need to get together and think really quite hard and quite seriously about how we might go forward on that. The third point and final point I wanted to make is that I talked about taking targets seriously if you're going to have them. I would just make a plea for thinking about the demand side. So I think it is poor, to put it politely, that although we have plenty of supply side targets in terms of infrastructure deployment in Europe, the Commission declined this time to set a demand side target for actual adoption of ultra-fast broadband beyond 2020. And at the moment, my understanding is we have about 1 in 3 households that are passed by networks in Europe are passed by networks with capability of 100 megabits per second or more. Only 1 in 3 households are actually adopting that technology. And if we think about even current next generation technology of up to 30 megabits per second, it'll be 2022 on current trends, 2 years later than the Commission target, before we even get 50% of households in Europe on 30 meg, let alone a target of getting half of the households on 100 megabits per second, as the Commission proposed. So I think we have an adoption challenge, which is largely neglected by policymakers at the moment, and we need to be more focused on that. Two final thoughts on that I think are worth thinking about. One is I don't think the current state aid arrangements, which lack any kind of incentives on recipients of state aid to drive adoption, help. And I could make an argument to say they hinder adoption and deter recipients from driving adoption because of the way that clawback mechanisms work. And secondly, I think we need to, in my view, think more carefully about collective switching programs. If you look at the way that people are thinking of driving migration to renewable energy services, for example, it's not done by sitting down and waiting for individual householders one by one to migrate from one infrastructure to another. I suspect a more proactive and more engaged process, collaborative between the industry and the regulators, is going to be required to really drive the demand side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think these are some sobering remarks indeed, that there is a risk of stranded assets, there's not enough attention to demand, there's no lack of cheap money, but it's not easy to get it in the right direction, and current proposals won't meet the ambition. I think the other panelists have been more competition, and perhaps the panelists would react to especially our last speaker, but also to each other. Mr. Lombardini, would you care to react to what you've heard?
I have nothing to add. I think that it was very clear that from my colleague from Portugal, when there is competition and when there is a sufficient regulation, everything goes well. I mean, there is no issue of lack of money or any question about NGAs. If there is enough players to push competition, it progresses quite fast because there is an appetite from the consumers which is very strong. So we are quite lucky. There is a market with a strong demand. The technology are perfectly ready. And I think that at the end, FTTH is the technology that will be everywhere in Europe. In some countries, it starts with copper that is modernized, or with cable which is upgraded, or with FTTC. But at the end, we will all have FTTH, which is a perfect passive infrastructure, which delivers very high bandwidth, which is neutral and competition friendly. So what we need is regulation which is sufficient enough, not to block any investments from the incumbent, but to allow the investment from the altnets to be part of the game. But I would be very optimistic, and we can see both in Portugal, in France, in Spain, that FTTH is progressing well with no major obstacle in the current framework.
The ambitions?
I think so.
You think so too?
I agree also.
Could you comment on that?
I think it would be useful to pick up on a point that Richard made about dealing with the passive infrastructure layer, and the fact that if you can release the passive infrastructure, you can draw investments into it, and you can get the efficiencies of sharing. Certainly in the UK, we've had the debate recently around the independence of Openreach, and I think with the advent of 5G, we've actually got the opportunity right from the outset to create independent infrastructure so that we can get the benefits of sharing and investment in the most efficient manner.
Brad, any further?
I was just wondering if there's a way of combining the first point and the third point. I mean, the problem of dealing with these stranded assets, and if there's a regulatory move that encourages the sharing but also helps manage the stranded assets in the same move, that would be that would encourage the incumbents to participate in in duct sharing or in sharing the passive fiber in exchange for some support in some way for dealing with the stranded asset.
To pick up one of the tweets, is sharing the future of this business? And how do we incentivize that if incentivization is needed, or does it come from itself? Co-investment is one model, sharing infrastructure I've heard several times.
There are some essential facilities that need to be shared, like in an access SMP model, because ducts and poles we cannot make again. So when we talk about fiber and passive access, I think we should prefer own investment or co-investment rather than some kind of regulation, access regulation on that. Well, if you are in white areas or if you have state aid, you need to ensure that everybody goes there, and maybe symmetric regulation, or to be sure that state aid is well applied and all operators can use it. Maybe it would be the solution for that. But those are very, very specific areas in Portugal, and so the majority of the territory should be addressed, ensuring some access on essential facilities, and the rest should be left to initiatives of co-investment. But real co-investment.
Does that benefit from some deregulatory measures?
Well, I don't believe so. I think co-investment will emerge because it's interesting, it's economically interesting for companies. And again, I've already said it, and I think Iliad said it also, we cannot believe on a regulated offer of an incumbent that says, here is my infrastructure and please you can use it. So it's like co-investment, and then regulators should deregulate. We don't believe in that, and we think it's a big danger that we face on the new code.
I think Mr. Fisi feels different about that. I mean, the merger kind of test is interesting, but difficult, I guess.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think, when we talk about sharing, what we really mean is monopoly. Okay, the reason people are sharing is because actually it makes no sense. The risk if you duplicate is so high that neither will build. So I think we need to get back to being very clear about what we think are really enduring monopoly assets in the value chain. And maybe it's towers and maybe it's other things as well. So it makes no sense. There's no economic benefit, there's no innovation benefit from having people duplicating those, even if they could. Think about how we're going to deal with those. And then the second issue is, okay, if there's nothing wrong with having monopoly assets, and they only become problematic if you've also got vertical integration. So then you've got to think about, how do we want the ownership structure of these assets? If they're not vertically integrated, if they're not participating in the downstream retail market, you don't have any interesting regulatory issues particularly. And you think it's a monopoly. So I think we need to, co-investment is really just code for saying the firms have concluded that the efficient outcome is one infrastructure which they share. And so I think the question is really a question about being much clearer about what we think really are these monopoly assets that enable competition and innovation on top of that. And how do we think they should be regulated? Should they be owned by firms that are vertically integrated or not? It seems to me once you answer those questions, the resulting regulatory framework is not that complicated. But we dance around it because we come from a background here where we have essentially vertically integrated firms and where we don't want to concede that there is a sort of enduring monopoly issue.
Are there examples in Europe where an incumbent has entered into a co-investment or a sharing relationship and not built a parallel infrastructure?
Yeah. Actually, we have all kind of examples, including that. Yeah.
Because in the U.S., there are no examples that I can think of where that's happened. And what has happened is when, as an example, when Google went to a market with Google Fiber, AT&T announced we're going to deploy fiber. They hadn't announced it before, and the whole idea is to split the market, reduce the return on a really significant fiber investment, and build a parallel network. That is a strategy that just doesn't seem to benefit anybody other than trying to preclude investment in that infrastructure.
In Portugal, we have a specific. Well, I would only talk about what is public, but and it's with not. It is with my company. It isn't with my company, but we have 4 operators also. Four of them fully integrated operators, and the incumbent a few years ago made an agreement with Vodafone, and they tried to share some households, fiber households, and but I don't know if it went very well, because now Vodafone made an agreement with us and stopped sharing houses. Well, they had their houses already shared, and now they are sharing with someone else. So we have an example, but I don't know really if it works. Well, I cannot comment on that. I don't know, but the truth is that in Portugal, NOS was in very different positions since the beginning. We were the third mobile operator, then we were the Maverick operator, then we were the first to launch FTTH, and now we are the major one. So, and from the beginning until now, we always defended co-investment. Always, and we will always strive for co-investment, even though we didn't have always success on that, but we always defended that. So it's possible to defend the same position despite the position that you are in the market.
Can I comment on sharing? I mean, I think sharing infrastructure brings many benefits to the operators, but I would argue that these don't need to be regulated monopolies. And maybe our perception that there are monopolies and they need to be regulated and access needs to be regulated, maybe our vision is tinted by legacy rollout, which used to be led by vertically integrated telcos. And frankly, vertically integrated telcos are not the best owners of shared infrastructure assets. The statistics I was showing earlier from Ernst & Young showed that where towers have been held independently for over 5 years across Europe and North America, they have twice the number of sharers than the towers held by mobile operators. Now, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and across the world now, 68% of towers have been outsourced by the mobile operators to the independent sector, because the independent sector frankly manages them better, gets higher levels of utilization, invests in more substantial and higher capacity assets. And what we do as a business is we enter competitive tendering processes every day for concessions to roll out new infrastructure. And that could be, you know, £1 million of fibre small cells that we've installed in one of the tallest buildings in the City of London. It can be small cells that we've installed in Aberdeen. You know, we will undoubtedly be competing for the concession to install shared infrastructure in the London Underground. So there is a competitive way of doing this, but the wholesale only model is the way to keep that independence and to ensure that the incentives are there to share. So in many cases, it's the venue owner or the franchise owner. So in the tallest building in the City of London, it was the landlord who wants to provide better coverage for the tenants of the building and came out to the market, and Wireless Infrastructure Group competed with the mobile operators, and we won that concession. Effectively, we put in what we call everything but the radio. So you put in the whole infrastructure, fibre runs throughout the building, distributed antenna system with RF over fibre, and the mobile operators get to share that infrastructure, and all they need to do is plug in their base station. But it can be driven by, it can be driven from both ends. It can be driven by venue owners who want better coverage. We're also rolling out dozens of new towers in remote rural areas, and those are being done for mobile operators who want better coverage, who want to meet their license obligations, but in those situations they would prefer to buy shared infrastructure because it's lower total cost of ownership for them. And so they become our anchor tenant and they commission us to build the tower.
I just wanted to back up that point because, you know, if you think about something like duct sharing, so it's a sort of a bit of an analogy, and just think about the incentives. Ownership matters. So if you're the vertically integrated firm that owns the ducts and already have your infrastructure in them, you have zero incentive if there is a capacity constraint to increase capacity to allow other people to share. Zero incentive. If you're a third-party owner of that and you make your money by increasing the utilization of the asset, you have fabulously strong incentives to upgrade the infrastructure and get as many people in the duct as possible. And I don't understand how we have a new Commission policy that appears to be, you know, founded to some extent on or anchored in promoting passive access, and we don't think about these ownership issues and the incentive properties.
I suggest we look to the audience and see if there are any questions or comments. Yes, here. Sebastian.
Thank you. I'm Sebastian Soriano from France, and this year chairman of BEREC, for those who don't know me. I have just two questions. The first one is a question to Richard Fizzi. You mentioned the idea that maybe regulators could look ex ante at co-investment scheme in order to approve them in a certain way. I would like to well understand if the idea of this approval would be approval regarding the fact that if this co-investment scheme is good, then we don't need any ex-ante SMP regulation, or is it an approval regarding competition law? Because I'm asking, because for instance in France we have such a principle for mobile sharing agreement, because there are several sharing agreements in France, and we had huge debates about the fact to know whether these agreements were pro or anti-competitive. And in the end, the lawmaker says, well, these agreements are so important about how the market works. Let's give the power to the regulator to modify, if necessary, these agreements, rather than letting competition law arrive and decide years after. So I was asking, what kind of approval are you considering regarding these two options or others? I have also a question to Brad Burnham from Union Square Venture. As I understand, you are investing in startups. Maybe it's not totally linked with the subject of the roundtable, but maybe you can find a link. But I was wondering whether you consider Europe as an attractive place to invest in startups and, for instance, in the field of the Internet of Things. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. First, Richard?
So the idea is that I think the regulator could, if the regulator finds problematic aspects of the agreement, so it's very similar in my mind to a merger. The parties make proposals, the regulator would examine the agreement, would understand how it was going to work and so on. If there are problematic features, so for example, the parties were sharing elements of the infrastructure that actually the regulator thought would be competitive and there wasn't really a good commercial justification, you could then agree changes to the agreement so that there would be a final form of agreement that would be approved. And the important aspect of it for me is it binds the regulator. So that approval, so long as the agreement was then implemented in the form that it was approved, or clearly if there are changes to the agreement after the approval has been given, then the regulator would be able to come back in and say, well, hang on a minute, I didn't approve that agreement. But it would then commit the regulator to essentially saying either I'm not going to regulate at all, or I'm going to approve this subject to these regulatory conditions. So the regulator would, I think, be able to impose conditions or require commitments from the parties. I don't quite know which of those two it would be. It doesn't seem to me to matter. But after that, as it were, the parties would be able to implement the agreement in the knowledge that, provided they kept to the terms of the agreement, the regulator would not then change the rules ex post. Clearly, it would be highly desirable to avoid a situation in which the competition authority, with the regulator having approved it, then dives into the and voids the agreement. I understand in some countries the challenges of sort of doing that, but I think things could be worked out so that, and essentially it would be a competition analysis. The regulator would effectively be doing the same sort of analysis that an authority would do when reviewing a merger.
Right, on startups. So, Union Square Ventures has made about 70 investments over the course of 10 years, and about 13 of those investments have been in Europe. And I think we like Europe as an investment opportunity. Concentration of those investments have been London, Berlin, with a couple others scattered around Germany, one in Porto. And I think we have a new generation of entrepreneurs in Europe that are willing to fail. And I think the culture in Europe is beginning to accept that idea that it's okay. And we still have a ways to go there, but I think that's been a big improvement. Everything I've heard here today gives me a great deal of comfort investing at the applications layer and feeling confident that the infrastructure layer is not going to in some way prejudice the user experience at the applications layer. So I think that's very encouraging. I think the GDPR is going to be a challenge. We have, as an example, one US-based company, just one example. It's a company called Duolingo. It's based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They provide language learning services. They have about 20 million users, 6 or 7 in Europe, and they've calculated it's something like a $4 million investment to become compliant, and it's an 8-month effort to become compliant with GDPR. And advertising is really not a very big part of their business model. The only reason they use data is to optimize the learning experience, but they're caught up in the regulation, the way the regulation is written. So I think that one of the things that, I know this is not the competence of this group, but one of the things that Europe could do that would be really exciting would be to create a safe harbor for startups under the GDPR. And there's the way I would propose to do that is to say that if users have complete access, not go to Ireland at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and get a printed file of your data, but instead have a real-time read-write access to your data, which they can then do whatever they want with. That, for a variety of reasons, unlocks market power at the applications layer and achieves a lot of the objectives that I think the GDPR wants to achieve in terms of creating domestic competition, creating domestic alternatives to global companies. But it does it in a way that doesn't impose a lot of cost. So,
any further questions? Yes, please. Just wait for the mic.
Yes, my name is Sarah Anderson. I'm from the Swedish regulator. I'm getting back to the issue of infrastructure sharing, because we have a good example in the mobile markets and infrastructure sharing in Sweden, where we issued the 3G licenses some years ago, many years ago actually. And we now, for a country having 9 million inhabitants, it's quite good to have 5 parallel mobile network operators. And what we did by then was that in the licensing conditions, we authorized all the network investors to share 100% passive infrastructure and up to 70% active radio infrastructure. And that was an analysis that we did together with the competition authority, making sure to give the investing operators a sustainable and future-proof regulatory environment to do this investment with. And it has been a really success story because coverage is now one of the main features when competing with each other. The rate of coverage throughout the countryside, thanks to this solution. So I can really give you this as a good example on infrastructure sharing in the mobile sector.
Is that a question to anyone in particular?
I was coming back on the infrastructure. I was just commenting on so maybe this targets one of the points that you were mentioning on infrastructure sharing, on how to do it not to end up in regulatory uncertainty. So maybe it's a question to Richard Feasey. Would this create the kind of legal certainty that you were aiming at when you talked about ex ante and ex post regulation being synchronized on infrastructure sharing?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. Thank you for that, because I think infrastructure sharing clearly does play a great role in improving end user customer experience and improving the coverage. And in a similar fashion to Sweden, mobile operators in the UK are permitted to share their passive infrastructure. They also share base stations with a more RAN or multi-operator RAN technology. And we got 2 JVs in the UK that did a lot of sharing across their 3G rollout. But I think there's a great deal of difference between allowing people to share infrastructure and forcing them to, because there are, they have got some benefit from sharing, but there are also limits to it. And when they've rolled out their 4G networks, we've seen a lot more unilateral rollout as the mobile operators want to keep that competitive tension for customers for the new services. And arguably it's that competitive tension in some of the 4G rollout that's actually driven their investment. And often they've turned to independent infrastructure again, where they need to do some of the sharing, but they're still they're still able to create their competitive edge by actually having their independent unilateral networks when they wish to.
Further comments? Is Sweden a good example of where we want to go?
Well, I think it's a kind of good example. In Portugal, we have some specific agreements on sharing masts and civil infrastructure for mobile, but we don't have anything else. And even though we have a lot of antennas all over the place, and 3 antennas, normally 3, because the 4th operator is an MVNO, so 3 antennas at the same time in the same place. So I think it should be a good example to look at when we think about 5G deployment, at least sharing civil infrastructures.
I think it's going to vary enormously by market. So I think there may be some markets, I think France seems to be one of those where, through a mixture of sort of historic, the way the market has developed, the nature of the firms in the market, the competitive conditions are such that the incentives on the companies to mutualize some assets and to share things may work, and the regulator can to some degree step back. But there'll be other countries, it seems to me, other markets where those competitive conditions just don't exist, and there's only one firm, and they have very weak incentives to share, and that's why I quite favour on things like co-investment more of a sort of case-by-case competition type analysis that says let's look at the, if we don't allow sharing or require sharing, what is the alternative here? And the alternative will be very different, it seems to me, even within a country. For these kinds of networks, the alternative can be very, very different. So I'm not sure that sort of blanket rules, a bit like the Commission was proposing, I think, in relation to co-investment, are necessarily going to be very sensible here. Because I just think the competitive conditions, the commercial dynamics between the firms differ enormously between countries and even within countries in relation to this next generation of technology.
Further comments from the panel on this? There's another question, I know. Yes, please.
What was said in Sweden, I did 3 auctions in Germany when I was a regulator, and we also had coverage obligations, and Wilhelm knows that, which go up to 98% on rural areas. For years, we had the possibility to share passive infrastructure. And I think it's amazing that people think it's a new idea. I think if you look on the figures, towers are shared for more than 15 years between 2 or 3 operators. That's nothing new. Together with a competition authority, it was also possible to share active radio network, but it was not enforced. So it was, and I think this is the crucial point in the whole discussion. Do we want to enforce all over Europe a specific model? Or do we just want to let it to the operators? I rolled out a fiber network where 2 operators, by the way, Colt and Level 3, shared a fiber ring in the 90s, in 95. So they agreed commercially and did the rollout together. Not a problem at all, So I think, and when you do it independently, some mobile operators even sourced out their whole network to Alcatel or to Lucent. Was, by the way, not a very good deal for Alcatel-Lucent, but they shared out their complete networks. They had no own infrastructure. They just operated. All this is possible, and all this is not new. I'm sometimes a little bit amazed to say this is something a brilliant new idea. But the crucial point, and I would like if you share that argument, is leave it to commercial agreements. And don't enforce a specific model all over Europe, And all these models, even the third-party investment, I think is not a regulated model, When you do some investment, and when you do co-investment in Portugal, it's up to the co-investors to whom they open up the network. And I think that's a border we shouldn't cross. The co-investors decide, the third-party investors decide, they have commercial agreements. I think the border we have to cross is there a regulated access for not co-investors, for only service providers, And that's only possible if you have what Richard said. I hope, Richard, maybe you can elaborate that. That's only when you either take public money, public funds, where it's anyhow like that, or when you are in an extreme rural area where you are a monopoly. But this is, I think, the crucial division between 2 models, and we shouldn't make a pattern for all over Europe of co-investment. And it's already there. I think it's nothing brilliant new ideas.
Richard, any comment?
Well, I mean, not really, except that I do think what the Commission is trying to do, I'm not sure they've been very successful, is to encourage. I think the intention of the code is to encourage operators to innovate a bit more commercially and to come to sort of arrangements with their assets where the operators themselves have agreed sharing arrangements of one kind or another on commercial terms. And the question, fundamentally is that works if if you map those incentives onto an industry that has those incentives. And the answer is in some cases they do, and in some cases they clearly don't. And so I think there's a bit of a test for the industry here as well of how innovative is the industry prepared to be. And I think there ought to be, to some extent, I've said in the past that there needs to be room to allow commercial innovation between firms who have, some common interests, but also are also competing with each other. And we haven't really had some innovation in Portugal, some innovation in France. There could be more innovation. Let's face it. And if the new framework leaves some space to allow that innovation, then I think that's a good thing. But if it doesn't come, then you need to have a sort of plan B. You can't just, I think, hold your hands up and say, oh well, we are in a world of vertically integrated monopoly players, and that's it. So I'm a bit of a fan of putting down a challenge to the industry, creating some space to allow innovation to occur, but also having tools that if it doesn't, that you try and make some progress, because otherwise we just won't get anywhere.
Yes, coming to sharing of network, I think there is not only the commercial agreements, because there is sometimes some specific situation. If I look to France, which is the country that I know the better, we are a new entrant as a mobile operator, coming 15 years after the 3 others. So you can imagine we have less sites to share. So it put us in a complicated situation because the 3 incumbents are not eager to share their network with the new entrant. We will enter the Italian market, it will be worst. So in such situation, we think that leaving the market to commercial agreement would not be the right option. On the fiber network, on the co-investment, the experience that we have is that it is not only guidelines that says you have to co-invest. When you reach the point where you have to interconnect customers, you realize that the details are very important. Getting the relevant address, there is billion of fiber in the ground that you have to identify and to connect, and you need at a point of time the threat of a potential action of the regulator, or at the end you can have a beautiful commercial agreement, but then when coming to the competition on the ground, when you need to get access to the address, all the IT process, the optical routes, the maintenance of the network, it is much more complicated than unbundling a copper network. So I do not believe that only the commercial agreement can be the solution, neither on mobile nor on the on fiber.
To respond to the point you made earlier that infrastructure sharing should be allowed, but it should not be forced. I mean, certainly, I think it's very important that regulators look at specific markets and situations, and where you have every incentive to share infrastructure already, if you create any intrusive access regulation that's unwarranted, then you're going to create investment uncertainty and you're going to switch off the pipeline of investment. So I think it's very important that you don't apply access regulation, you don't threaten any kind of price controls, you don't threaten any terms of access if the incentives are already there, and you only intervene where absolutely necessary, where there isn't regulation. And just commenting on Sweden, I was on the receiving end of a presentation about fiber rollout in Sweden. I understand you've achieved incredibly high levels of fiber to the premise in Sweden. And the people presenting it to us attributed that to the high degree of competition at the infrastructure level that arose in Sweden when the metropolitan networks were created to challenge the incumbent operator. And I think one way that you can really get a lot more done is to think actively about how do you encourage competition at the infrastructure level, and how do you encourage those challengers to rise up against the incumbents and create that environment.
One of the tweets to the panel, it says, for 5 years we've heard from big telcos that the EU is lagging behind. No investments, bad regulation. Has this been untrue for all the time? And why did they tell us? Any comments? I think Maxime and Brad have been quite clear about this. The others have been less outspoken, perhaps. No further comments. Any questions from Steve?
I would quite like Faith to come back to this sharing question and the related question of incentives, because I think what I'm hearing is that, you know, often there is a commercial incentive to share, in which case we should just leave you alone to do it. That's fine.
Can you speak up a bit?
So sharing
That's better.
and incentives. Sometimes there is a commercial incentive, in which case that's great, and it's a permissive, you know, there's permission and you get on with it. But sometimes the incentives are wrong, particularly where there's vertical integration. And I think what the Commission has been trying to do in its proposals is shift those incentives. We have had a similar discussion in the UK as to whether we can shift the incentives faced by BT by structurally separating them. That's an extreme approach to changing incentives. I suppose my practical question to the panel is, you know, what are the practical options for changing the incentives of a vertically integrated incumbent, short of breaking them up? Short of breaking them up.
Well, happy to get the ball off on that. So what's interesting is in the current proposals for the European Electronic Communications Code, there is a new piece recognising that there is a new industry model called wholesale-only infrastructure. And so Article 77 actually deals with wholesale-only infrastructure, and says if you're truly independent, then you're going to provide every incentive to access for all operators. And therefore Article 77 says to encourage investment in that infrastructure, there will be a lighter touch regulatory regime. And that means that investors get the certainty they need over a long period of time to invest in wholesale-only infrastructure. So we do appreciate that model, and we applaud that model. Now, Steve's question, I think, was driving to if the ultimate answer is truly independent infrastructure, independent of control and independent of ownership, then, but we're not starting there necessarily with the incumbents, then what can you do in the meantime? And I think Ofcom in the UK are moving in the right direction with OpenReach in having separate controls, separate governance, functional separation, legal separation. I'm obviously biased. I'm going to say, you know, that totally independent infrastructure is the final answer. But certainly I think what Ofcom have done with legal separation moves us in the right direction.
What is the case for integration? Vertical integration.
I can report on the case that's been pitched to me, and I don't believe it. But the argument is obviously that it provides you know, high margin application layer businesses allow us to subsidize the deployment in or the investment in, you know, very expensive infrastructure. That's the argument. I think where that argument breaks down is that it turns out that infrastructure by itself is a good business, and you know, we've seen that in the investments that we've made in infrastructure, and I think it's also true that you know, early in my career when I was working at AT&T, we saw the emergence of the internet, and there was a lot of interest on the part of the senior management of AT&T to get access to those application layer margins, you know, and so they built out a whole bunch of services that were going to compete with Yahoo and Google and others that were, you know, pretty disastrous in terms of they were ultimately all shut down because that wasn't our core competence. And it turns out that when you get into those businesses, the margins, those are competitive businesses too, and the margins aren't actually, you know, going to support that much infrastructure build. So I think there's a huge argument for you know, recognizing where, you know, where an organization's competence is, focusing their energies on, you know, really exploiting that competence and not vertically integrating.
I was just going to answer Steve's question in a sort of rather technical way, but I mean, it, you know, it just seems to me that you get sharing if the expected returns from sharing for the firm concerned are higher than the expected returns from not doing. And the problem I think regulators face is in order to make that equation work. So you are, you know, let's be honest, you are trading off a degree of market power in return for some kind of policy objective, or you're going to just give them a great big bribe in terms of public money or something. But I'm not sure that given the other duties that regulators have, such as to promote competition, there is an equation where you can get an outcome where you can make the incentive for a firm to share higher, the payback for that higher than the incentive for not sharing in most cases. Unless the firm faces a significant threat of competition, of being overbuilt by another firm anyway, in which case sharing is likely to be a better payoff for them than just sitting there and being overbuilt by somebody else, which is why you see, in my view, sharing arrangements emerge as the kind of second stage of the game in markets where you've got credible firms such as Maxime's who otherwise have the capacity to be able to build themselves. But if you don't make that payoff work, they won't.
Further questions? We have some 10 minutes left, I guess. So the opportunity to take one or two more. Yes, in the back.
So, Luc Hendricks from ECTA. I have a question, and maybe more for Richard or for the other as well. Because we speak about incentive, and if you would believe from the way to increase your return on capital employed, you would have an interest to share your capex, because you would think that if the final objective is to have effective competition, the market would be shared between different players, and at the end, the operators would more or less achieve the same sales result, whatever capex they would spend, independently of if they would share it. And then if they would share it, they would manage to have higher returns on capital employed. And so would the best incentive to have the incumbents to move into co-investment models not be the fact that it would strengthen the remedies on the SMP regime and make sure that they understand that the end game is to have effective and sustained competition, and at the end the market will be shared between different players instead of trying to do it the other way around. And so by the fact that they would understand that you would have 3 or 4 players or even more on the market, there is no need to continue to fight to defend the biggest part of the cake for yourself, because what we want is competition.
Not quite sure about the question, but maybe one of you is.
So the way I think about it is if you believe that the alternative to sharing is that you're going to get the same level of competition anyway, because the operators or your competitors could otherwise either have another network or could build their own network or whatever, then I think you're right, Luke. I think the first best option is to share your network. But I don't think anyone believes that. So, and if you think that if you're comparing a less competitive market and the returns that you make from that by not sharing with the additional wholesale, compared to the additional wholesale revenues that you make by sharing your assets, then experience suggests, at least in the telecoms industry, that people think you get a better return by not sharing.
The regulatory framework, not to make sure that we get quicker and in a more intrusive way to that level of competition. Because if what we see today on the code is that we weaken the SMP regime, we weaken the remedies that can be applied and so on, should it not be the other way around, that you quicker get to that level of competition? And so then would foster the sharing of infrastructure, because everybody would understand that there is no way to escape the final game to have sustainable competition.
You might be right, but I wonder. I think it might be the other way around. So I think you might need assets that are shared first, in order to get the competition, rather than getting the competition in order to share the assets. So that's why I'm a bit in favour of identifying the assets that are genuinely monopoly assets and spinning those out. And why should a vertically integrated firm own those? It doesn't make any sense to me. But you need to be careful what those assets are. But it's the ducks and the pole. It's the stuff where it makes nobody would think, if you went outside this room and asked people in the street, why don't we dig up the streets again to put more ducts in? People would think you were mad. So there's no sense economically to me in having, you just have somebody owning. That's a national infrastructure that should be owned, and then should be the platform over which we establish competition, in my view.
I was a part of a conversation in the United States where there was a suggestion that if there were a requirement in a market that is really underserved today, so let's say the highest speed you can get is, DSL 28 megabits, something like that, and if there was a requirement to deliver 100 megabits symmetrical within a time period, and an incumbent had a choice of looking at that and saying, okay, well, I've got to do a build, and I can either share the build or not, but I got to do a build or I lose my franchise. Has that ever been tried in Europe, or is that? Because it does seem like it would solve that problem of creating an incentive to share before the competition is there.
Any final comments from the panel?
Well, I think just a final comment that I agree with Richard, that I think ownership is a very important determinant of the incentives to share the infrastructure. And that if we can get access to ducts, then we can invest a lot more. We can roll out fibre for 5G small cells in our case. Just to sort of widen the debate slightly, one of the biggest underserved markets at the moment is enterprise in-building coverage. And again, if we can unlock the asset, which is, in that case, is the spectrum, if we could, like the US, get access to some shared spectrum for private networks, then you can roll out and invest in new networks in buildings, solve the coverage problem in buildings. So getting access to assets when they're kind of held by a small number of parties, is important for unlocking those investments.
Any other final comments?
My only final comment would be to say that within the review, we have to try to take into account the fact that all the markets of Europe are not the same in terms of level of deployment of the networks, of choice in terms of technologies, in terms of capacity to be digital, and that we have really to leave to the NRAs a strong capacity to make it in adequation with each one of the market, and not to try to be too optimistic and to go too fast in sizing a single solution for all the countries of Europe, or we will really miss the target.
I agree. I fully agree. It's a thing that we didn't talk about, and I fully agree. One of the lessons that we have to learn, and seeing our conversation and the examples that we heard of, is that we need to leave some space to national authorities to look at the competitive environment on the countries, because really one size doesn't fit all.
Richard, final remarks? No need to.
My only comment was in relation to this issue about copper. We last time I looked, the industry, the European wireless industry, had written off over 100 billion euros of goodwill So I don't regard necessarily the write-off of the copper assets as being an insurmountable challenge, but it's one that requires quite a lot of thought.
I'm not going to try and summarize this panel, but let me remind you of some things we've heard. We've heard that the EU may be better positioned now and in the future to grow in telecoms, but maybe not good enough to reach the ambitions of the Commission. We've heard that there's plenty of cheap money around, but it may not be invested in telecoms if there's a regulatory risk to be taken. And sharing infra may be the future, but we need the right conditions where regulation can either block or maybe help to get there. I suggest we thank the panelists in the usual way.